Mr. President, I come to the floor today to join my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, in raising the alarm about a decision I believe represents politicized policymaking at its very worst. Just a few weeks ago, we were notified that the Trump administration's Interior Department seeks to open up 90% of America's waters to oil and gas drilling. This was startling news for Americans everywhere, but particularly those of us who come from states along the Atlantic and Pacific coastline who had no expectation that our coastal waters were about to be subjected to the search for oil and gas. The objections to the Trump administration's decision came swiftly from elected officials in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, because protecting America's fragile coastlines isn't or shouldn't be a partisan issue. This decision by President Trump and Secretary of the Interior Zinke was not rooted in public input or scientific analysis. This decision was not based on concerns about community safety or economic prosperity. This decision was our administration putting their quote-unquote energy dominance goals above all else. I know several of my colleagues have already spoken out to discuss what this means for their states and how it will impact their constituents, but I'm here today to raise my voice for mine, to fight for Delaware. And in Delaware, our coasts are critical to our local environment and our robust economy. Delaware has 28 miles of Atlantic coastline, some of the most pristine, most beautiful beaches in the entire country. And as you can see in this graphic of our boardwalk at Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, our 28 miles of coastline employ 10% of our total state workforce. That's a remarkable amount of economic activity in a very small space. Our coastline generates $6.9 billion in economic activity every year and hosts thousands of acres of protected land. It includes, on our bayshore side, 2 national wildlife refuges that serve as critical habitat for bald eagles, white-tailed deer, and striped bass. The future of our coastal economy depends on recreational access, on fishing and tourism, which are now potentially at risk because of this ill-advised decision to open the coastline off of Delaware and the rest of the mid-Atlantic to potential oil and gas exploration and production. My colleagues here know that I make an effort to promote pragmatic and bipartisan ideas. It's one of my top priorities, day in and day out, to work across the aisle and do what's right for our constituents and for the United States. So let me be clear. My view is not based in an anti-oil or natural gas message. I support an all-of-the-above energy strategy and have advanced legislation that would embrace an all-of-the-above energy strategy. And I acknowledge there are many places in the United States where we can and do safely produce these resources, both onshore and offshore. But what if we happen to face a spill of the scale and size of Deepwater Horizon? This is an overlay of the footprint of the 2010 oil disaster at Deepwater Horizon and how it spread to impact the Gulf coastline. It's perhaps a little hard to see here, but the state of Delaware and New Jersey and its fragile coastline are underneath that footprint, and it suggests how we might end up facing dramatic impacts, negative impacts on tourism and fishing that depend on clean coastlines to support tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of economic activity in my home state. If we're going to think seriously about doing this, we need to think about the impacts. We need to ask whether the costs outweigh the benefits. And when it comes to the Trump-Zinke plan to drill off the coast of Delaware, I'm here to tell you that the potential costs dramatically outweigh the benefits. As you can see in this graphic, a spill the size of the Deepwater Horizon one could devastate all of our beach communities and protected wildlife areas in Delaware and the region. And again, Mr. President, protecting our coastlines, an idea supported by scientists and coastal residents alike, should not be a partisan issue. In Delaware alone, multiple city councils all up and down our coast have openly opposed offshore drilling through letters and resolutions they have sent to me and the rest of our congressional delegation. Coastal lawmakers from both parties have opposed offshore drilling, and I know for a fact the same is happening virtually every other coastal state potentially impacted by this unwise decision. These are the people we should be listening to, the people who don't just visit the coast for a week in the summer, but who live on it, who rely on it, who've built their lives and their local economy around it. Instead, as this decision shows, the Trump administration is prioritizing the oil and gas industry and partisan politics over those of independent scientists, coastal residents, and the elected officials who speak for our coastal communities. That was made painfully clear when the Republican governor of Florida, a close ally of the president, petitioned to shield just Florida from potential oil and gas exploration and production. Sure enough, Florida promptly got a public promise from Secretary Zinke that its coastlines would be spared. I'm sure Florida's coastline is beautiful. In fact, I visited Florida's coastline, and I can tell you, it's beautiful. But guess what? So is Delaware's. We deserve to be able to protect our coastline just as much as Floridians do. So I invite Secretary Zinke to once again come to Delaware, but to instead see the coastline and see these fragile resources and see what they have to offer for wildlife, for conservation, for fishing, for hunting, and for tourism. Secretary Zinke promising to exempt Florida is the Trump administration deciding which states have to deal with oil and gas drilling based purely on partisan political considerations. I think the state of our coastal communities and local economies shouldn't be auctioned off to the highest bidder or shouldn't be subject to partisan politics. Instead, they should be able to be protected based on science and based on the views of coastal communities. So I'm here today to voice my profound disappointment in this blatant neglect of local voices and the well-being of individual states and coastal communities. I came to the floor to fight for my state and to raise the local voices I've heard from our coastal communities. Mr. President, our coastlines are just too fragile and too vital and too important to let partisan politics get in the way of their future. Thank you. With that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.